In this second lesson, we're going to be talking about the origins of liberalism, and we're going to be getting into a little bit more of the theory behind liberalism and the kind of things that are advocated for, especially with classical liberalism. So we're going to first talk about the religious roots of liberalism, where liberalism comes from in terms of how it dates back to even the Reformation. We're then going to look at the real acceleration of liberalism in ideology in the Enlightenment period. And then we're going to look at the work and the philosophy of John Locke, talk about his theory on government by consent, ideas around social contract theory, and ideas of the state of nature, these kind of things as well. So, with this being said, the religious roots of liberalism really date back to before the Enlightenment, but to the Reformation. Okay? Now, the Reformation took place around the 15th and 16th centuries and were led by religious protesters, okay, such as Martin Luther and John Calvin. Okay, and this new Protestant Christianity argued that individuals seeking community with God, that there was no need to rely on priests or popes or any kind of intermediaries to have a relationship and talk with God. And that's where we get the idea of Protestantism as opposed to Catholicism. So the views and the ideas of Protestantism and the Reformation really began to spread across the European world with the advent of the printing press. So the printing press meant that the religious was able to be more widely accessible. So Luther argued that this could reform religion and into a more individualistic practice. And this idea of individualism, the idea of the individual and the self being at the centre of religion, is what ties the Reformation to the ideas of the Enlightenment. This is where the two periods in European history sort of have some kind of link in terms of their ideas. So the Enlightenment is really where we see the acceleration and the development of liberalism of classical liberalism as we know it today. So the Enlightenment period sought to take these individualist ideas that we see in the religious sector in the Reformation and try and incorporate that into the world of secularism. And the Enlightenment was an intellectual movement which emerged in the mid-17th century. Okay, this was especially around the time of the English Civil War. And ultimately, Enlightenment ideas influenced some of the major events in world histories. We have things like the Americans and the French revolutions in 1776 and 1789 consecutively. Ideas of liberalism really had an influence on these ideas. So the Enlightenment was defined by a belief in reason rather than a belief in faith. And this is how we can distinguish and delineate the Reformation and the feudal period before the Enlightenment period. Okay, among the radical ideas that emerged from that emerged from the Enlightenment were that each individual has some kind of free will, this freedom to make their own decisions and their own choices. And we have thinkers like John Locke who began to question the relationship that is between the people, between individuals, and between governments and between the state. So John Locke is really where we're going to begin by looking at liberalism. So he was he's usually seen as the key founder of liberalism, and his work, the Two Treatises on Government, is a very, very important founding document of liberalism. Locke had a number of key ideas and principles of political philosophy that are still relevant and important today, that are still discussed today, and still have relevance within modern political philosophy. So the first one we're going to talk about is the idea of government by consent. So Locke denied the notion that the state was somehow a part of God's creation. Okay, he rejected the idea by extension that there was some kind of notion of a divine right of kings, that the monarch, that the king had some kind of divine right from God to rule. And the point of the true state is to serve the interests of mankind, serve the interests of the individual, And this means that in order to serve the interests of the individual, of people, they must have consent from the people. And that's what the true purpose of the state is, and why government by consent is so important. And this means that the people who are governed by the state must consent to its existence, and must consent to the existence of the state. Another interesting idea is the idea of the state of nature. Okay, and this is an idea that was taken from Thomas Hobbes, who was also a political philosopher around the Enlightenment period, especially around the English Civil War. I believe he lived through the English Civil War. And the state of nature was the idea of a society before the existence of the state. Okay, so what was society like when the state didn't exist? And Hobbes's quite seminal work on political philosophy, Leviathan, really points to the key thinking of some of the philosophy around this period of time, because during the English Civil War there was questions about the extent to which the state of nature was a positive aspect of society, whether or not a society could live without a state, without the existence of the state. And these were obviously questions that were very relevant at the time, because there was a civil war. The existence of the state of nature was actually quite possible. However, unlike Thomas Hobbes, Locke believed that the state of nature was a lot more tolerable. Famously, Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan noted that the state of nature would be nasty, brutish, and short. If you want to know more about Thomas Hobbes and the state of nature, I have got a lesson on it somewhere that I will link in the description, where we go into we look a little bit more and do a bit more exegesis of the literature itself. So Hobbes describes society before the existence of the state as nasty, brutish, and short. I've just mentioned this. And Locke believed that the state of nature was underpinned by some kind of natural law and natural liberties and natural rights. So whereas Hobbes believed that a society without a state would, almost immediately collapse, it would be nasty, brutish, and short, there would be, a lot of problems. Locke believed that these problems wouldn't exist in the state of nature, because the state isn't the only thing that underpins society. It's actually things like natural laws, natural liberties, and natural rights that create that underpin society. So the alternative to the state of nature, the state of law, was designed to just improve upon what Locke believed was essentially a tolerable situation. For Locke, the state of law would be legitimate only if respected natural rights and natural laws. So, whereas Hobbes believed that without a state you couldn't have society effectively, it wouldn't be a tolerable situation. Locke believed that the state of nature is almost like the baseline for society, where you have these natural liberties, and that the state of law, there's a world with a state, with a government, should only be legitimate. You should only have a legitimate government if it first respects these natural rights and natural liberties. Okay, and the purpose of a government is to improve upon them, not to supplement them. And this moves on to the idea of social contract theory. So Locke's ideal state would always reflect the principle that its citizens had voluntarily consented to accept the state's rulings, in return for the state improving the situation. So the contract, the relationship between the people and the state, according to John Locke, was that the people would consent to the state's existence in order for the state to then improve the society that it governs. And this is an idea known as social contract theory. And essentially, the idea of social contract theory is that there is this kind of socially contracted agreement between the people and the state. Now, social contract theory is a little bit more complicated, ethically and philosophically, because it could incorporate, a presumptive social contract between two individuals. However, the way Locke talks about social contract within the realm of political philosophy is he talks about it within the relationship between the people and the state. So just one more time, just to reiterate, Locke believes that a state is only legitimate, it should only exist if the people consent to its existence. Okay, he believed that the state of nature, a society without a government, is something that can be tolerable because there exists some fundamental natural rights and liberties that people have. Okay, and that in order for a state to be legitimate, it must not only, one, get the consent from the people, but two, it must also respect these natural rights and natural liberties. And the relationship between the individuals and the state, this social contract, is that the citizens voluntarily accept and consent to the state's existence in return for the state to improve the situation of the society that it governs. So that's effectively how the state operates under the classical liberalism that we've been discussing in this lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to talk a little bit more about the way the economy is organised in a liberal state and the way society is organised in a liberal state, before we move on to look at the different varieties of liberalism.